At the end of last session, Bert asked two questions today. The first was, what does existential meaning, existential structure, or typical single existential whatever structure is? What is this supposed to mean? And what's the use of this? What does it use in this very sexual chapter? And the second question, which is obviously related, is then what does existence mean? And the answer to these questions lie in the characterization of the body, what the body means. And what we will see in this chapter, and this is another reason why it's really helpful to understand the way Merleau-Ponty deals with the problems it successively copes with in phenomenology perception, is that the body is here very clearly defined as a general function of transposition. But what you have to have in mind from the very beginning, and I will develop this. This general function of transposition means two things. It means general means, and that's why I'm relating it to the ambiguity, what Merleau-Ponty calls the ambiguity of the body. General means that the body is that thanks to which you're sort of carrying on with yourself a various array of conducts that arise in different situations. But the thing is, so what changes can be the situations, and this is one of the meanings of general. It's always there, you're carrying with yourself. And the second meaning of it, with which Merleau-Ponty deals mostly, or that's the pushes in this chapter, the second meaning of general, or the second part of this meaning, is that this generality is present in all of the layers that constitute the embodied life. So it means that the existential structure is being present at the biological level, as well as at the personal level, as well as at the perceptual level. Meaning sensory level. So that's why the existential structure is important. Well, it does because it shows that there's an internal connection between all these layers. That and these two meanings of general, you sort of always carry with yourself this very existential structure, and the meaning of being common to all the layers, right, is it's related to the very same empirical constancy, you might want to say, because obviously you can the thing Merleau-Ponty wants to stress is that you can say go from one situation to another that are completely different insofar as these layers are solicited by the situation. You can go from a purely biological situation to a purely personal situation. And even so, you'd be carrying with yourself this very same existential structure. And what this heads towards is the fact that the body, being general, has to be related with, once again, with what Merleau says in the preface, that the body is the only thing to which you can relate all the behaviors and the conducts of the human beings. It's that thanks to which you can have a global picture. Global picture. And this is how it's being phenomenological preserved. You need it in order to have a center to relate all these dimensions, the common point. And this means that, and this is very important, this is the way you have to understand what Merleau-Ponty says when he says that the flow of existence runs through the body and everything. All these kinds of metaphors. It simply means that all these dimensions of existence, as being related to the body, they can be understood insofar as connected to the body in its various conducts that you might first think of being separated, but precisely they're not. And this when Merleau-Ponty carries on and enters the sexual issue, So this is on page 158 in the old edition, so people ask me to mention the two pages. And in the new, it means the 183. It's just after the beginning of the paragraph. For Freud himself, the sexual is not the genital. Uh, okay, the whole beginning has to be right. So for Freud himself, the sexual is not the genital, meaning that sexuality is a dimension of existence that cannot only be related to the pure reflex-like working of the genital organs. Just an indication to it. This is mainly stated by Freud in the 3 phase on the theory of sexuality. Sexual life is not a mere effect of the process of having their seat in the genital organs. The libido is not an instinct, that is an activity naturally directed towards definite ends. It is the general power which the psychosomatic subject enjoys of taking root in different settings, of establishing himself through different experiences, of gaining structures of conduct. So this is what I call the existential structure, to sum it up. This is what causes a man to have a history. Insofar as a man's sexual history provides the key to his life, okay? So does that mean he's being reductionist in some way? It is because in his sexuality is projected so this is the intentional arc, right? Is projected his manner of being towards the world, that is towards time and other men. There are sexual symptoms at the root of all neurosis, but the symptoms, correctly interpreted, symbolize a whole attitude, the same existence. Whether, for example, one of conquest or of flight. Into the sexual history conceived as the elaboration of a general form of life, all psychological constituents can enter because there's no longer an interaction of two causalities, and because the genital life is geared to the whole life of the subject, feelings dimensional. So the thing is, this whole picture that I've been drawing, this general picture, is here used in order to show that it can sort of work to explore all dimensions of human life, even sexuality. And here what's interesting is that, what's the use of all this? Well, here it helps because you might want to use it to stress the different existential attitudes that can exist. Right? They can symbolize a whole attitude common to all these sectors. Whether, for example, one of conquest or of flight, which are not the same. So this would be Merleau-Ponty's account for one of the broad aims of psychoanalysis, which has been, you could say, character study or personality study, which some very eminent psychoanalysts have been defending. But the thing is, how can this be of use for us? We want to understand how the body, as a general function of transposition, is at work here. And to understand this, we need to reach towards the end of this, as usual, very long paragraph. So for me, it's 160, which means for you it could be 185. Well, there are two words in italic, expression and meaning, and my piece is just over them. So the sentence starts with, finally, as we have indicated above. Finally, as we have indicated above. So it's 5 lines. Okay. Thanks. Biological existence is synchronized with human existence, with this person, and is never indifferent to its distinctive rhythm. Nevertheless, we shall now add, living is a primary process from which, at a certain point, it becomes possible to live this or that world, with many to experience. And we must eat and breathe before perceiving and awakening to relational living, belonging to colors and lights through sight. Sound through hearing, to the body of another through sexuality, before arriving at the vice of human. The sight, hearing, sexuality, and the body are not only the roots, instruments, or manifestations of personal existence. The latter takes up and absorbs into itself their existence as it is anonymous. What this means is that, and this is the concrete way, and now Merleau-Ponty begins to explore the relationship between these dimensions and to say that to him they're not, or they shouldn't be conceived of as separated, thanks to this existential structure. And he discusses a very interesting case brought forward by Binswanger, So if you're interested in phenomenology, that guy might be worth reading because he was the only person who was at the same time personally with Heidegger, Husserl, and Freud, articulating many perspectives. And Foucault gave the preface of the first translation of his works in French. Obviously, I didn't know that. But it's the preface. Just a moment earlier, I've said that besides making constructions that you might like or dislike, wasn't the only aim Merleau-Ponty had in mind. And so now he uses this interconnection between layers that are being articulated by the body to explore the case given to us by Binswanger. So I might just, okay, I'll read the beginning of the next paragraph and I'll stress what I think matters. A girl whose mother has forbidden her to see again the young man with whom she is in love cannot sleep, loses her appetite, and finally the use of speech. An initial manifestation of this loss of speech is found to have occurred during her childhood, after an earthquake, and subsequently again following a series of frights. So now he says Freud might want to stress the importance of the oral phase of sexual development. But what matters is what nobody says here. But what is fixed, because he takes this issue and discusses it. But what is fixated on the mouth? Okay, so she uses appetite, you use the mouth for this, and the speech, use the mouth as well. What's fixated on the mouth is not merely sexual existence, but more generally those relations with others having the spoken word as their vehicle. So that means it's the general personal level that's being lost. Loss of speech, then, just a few lines after, stands for the refusal of coexistence, just as in other subjects. The fit of history is the means of escaping from the situation. The passion breaks with relational life, blah, blah, blah. And then her inability to swallow food arises from the fact that swallowing symbolizes the movement of existence, which carries events, and accumulates them. So what does that poetically coined phrase mean? It means that to understand the various symptoms that the girl has, you have to relate them to a general structure of existence. When he says that swallowing symbolizes the movement of existence, it means that the symptom she has, the fact that she won't eat, has to be understood first and foremost in relation to this existential structure that then allows you to understand the relationship between the different levels of life, which are touched by the very same symptom that you have to understand as this, not using the mouth in an existential way. So he proposes a particular account of psychopathology doing this. You have to relate this or that symptom to the way the body symbolizes existence. And then you can understand what the relation is between the fact that she won't eat, which would seem to be biological, and the fact that she won't talk. It's totally personal. The thing is, you have to be careful with the concept of origin when you use it. So would it mean that it would be starting from a sexual original experience, the way we discussed today? Is that what I mean? I just mean the sexual dimension of problem in that. Well, the thing is, to answer the question correctly, I would have to enter into the fact that for psychoanalysis, temporality is not linear temporality, and that the sexual dimension of the first episode, which is trauma, what Freud says is that the sexual signification of the trauma is acquired afterwards when you re-experience the second occurrence of it that can be symbolically related to the first. This is the meaning of sexual frustration. But if there is sexual frustration comes, yes, but fair enough. But the thing is, the first experience that she had was that of an earthquake, which isn't sexual first. I thought that was earthquake. So remember, I just said that this was an alternative way of presenting, or not maybe this alternative, but this was a way of dealing with a character study that is being dealt with in psychopathology. And now Merleau-Ponty clearly relates this and the fact that obviously there's something with the body, all right? It's really that provides the existential structure that embodies the existential structure. And Merleau-Ponty has a sentence that presents it. So for me, it's 162, 187. When he says thus in hysteria and repression. Let me when you have it. Okay. 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 Thus in hysteria and repression, we may well overlook something, although we know of it, because our memories and our body, instead of presenting themselves to us in singular and determinate conscious acts, are enveloped in generality. So there are few tendencies that are really important here, but this first one is very important because you know that psychoanalysis has been heavily using the concept of repression. It's the thing that you don't want to see, but that you know you don't want to see, and has been articulating the concept of, it's usually there's just one letter that changes with the concept of regression. It means that you're drawn back, that the meaning of the situation you're experiencing comes from the fact that you've been experiencing situations somehow related, similarly. That's what we were just discussing. So this is what Melville is dealing with now. And the way he understand the way you have to understand the character studies or the personality studies, the embodied personality studies that Merleau-Ponty wants to do here is that yes, there's a precise organ that's the symbolic center that allows you to understand that these dimensions are linked, and that shows obviously that they are. And the consequence of this is that the sentence that comes just after what I read, through this generality, meaning that the repression and hence the big importance of the mouth in the in this your erotical bodily scheme is that it helps understanding that, as Merleau-Ponty puts it, next sentence, we discover in this way that sensory messages or memories are expressly grasped and recognized by us only insofar as they adhere generally to that area of our body and our life to which they're relevant.
Yeah, opposing Freud and sexuality in this whole analysis, trying to do a whole story on this case and do it without doing sexuality or ambiguity. One. Well, exactly. I don't know. I'm not just reading from it.
I'll discuss this later because you need some other theoretical frameworks. Please. So this sentence is important because it reflects Merleau-Ponty's aim in a non-poetic way. So it's useful because it seems pretty straightforward. So it's thanks to the fact that this or that part of the body embodies a meaning and thus allows to understand the unique but ambiguous, because it's coming from these dimensions, the unique meaning that's being explained by the various context of the body. This is what existential structure is about. Yes. Well, it doesn't mean that, well, yeah, but it's obviously sexual. But, of course not, because precisely the fact that there's this zone of the generality means it's present in all situations and in all these layers. That's what it means. Only. Okay, so but this dimension, the fact that the mouth is prominent as far as you need to understand the pathological behaviors of a person in every situation or in every dimension. That's what it means. So there's no tension. Only if you take these two words, say this zone and the general dimension, there's no contradiction whatsoever. But then, as far as the sexual origin is concerned, you wouldn't say that. You would say that sexuality takes up and expresses something that's being, as you know, just said it in the sentence where he mentions all these layers. Sexuality is a way to express other dimensions, which wouldn't mean that they weren't here before in a way, but they didn't have the sexual meaning. Consider the relationship between the earthquake and the fact that then it acquires a sexual meaning. That's maybe what I would understand. What I would say. Does it satisfy you in any way? What's the problem with this? But it's a statement. You just see it. I mean, it's the same for psychoanalysis, right? You see that this say this, or what is it? Is what you want to say just that Merleau-Ponty isn't a psychoanalyst? So how can we organize and interpret the data that he gets while listening to the patient and see that this or that dimension is symbolically prominent? Is that your problem? No. Anyway, this is the sentence that I just read, the one with that area of our body and our life to which they're relevant. It's 188, I think, the one I just read. We discover in this way that sensory messages and okay. This is how Merleau-Ponty would find a use for this existential structure by relating it to the different kind of symptoms that can be seen in the different layers of embodied life. But this obviously happens because ultimately, as he said at the beginning of the chapter, all the dimensions that underlie the personal dimension, which includes sexual life, so the personal dimension takes up all the underlying dimension and expresses them at a personal level. This is why he says, so this is 166, 192, I think, for you. It's at the very end of the paragraph, 10 lines before the end of the paragraph that ends with abstract moments. So the sentence I'm starting with is, if we therefore say, this is about 10 lines. If we therefore say that the body expresses existence at every moment, this is in the sense in which a word expresses thought. Anterior to conventional means of expression, which reveal my thoughts to others only because already for both myself and them meanings are provided for each time, and which in this sense do not give rise to genuine communication at all, we must, as we shall see, recognize the primary process of signification in which the thing expressed doesn't exist apart from the expression, and in which the signs themselves induce their significance externally. In this way, so this is the crucial quote, the body expresses total existence, which is not only biological or perceptual or personal, not because it is an external accompaniment to that existence, but because existence realizes itself in the body. So there's nothing else besides the body, but you have to conceive of it in such a way as to allow different manifestations to have this existential relation between each other. And this cannot be done if you use the empiricist account, purely organical accounts, or the intellectualist account, because then, if you do this, you think that the relationship between these dimensions has to be found within consciousness. This is what I was thinking at the very beginning of the chapter, which is impossible because the common structure to all these is a bodily structure insofar as it embodies existence, which is embodying existence will only mean that it can allow for a switch or for the fact that this or this dimension comes to be more prominent than the others on their global framework. But then obviously you can say, well, you're saying that all these dimensions are related, but now you say that some of them, say the purely sexual in a sexual situation, it's going to be more prominent than the others. So what's the point then in saying that they have a relationship if you say that one is more prominent than the others? And this is what ambiguity, right? And this is what ambiguity means precisely. It means that even in sexual situations, there's something more global that's always present. And you can't reduce sexuality to what happens when you're in bed with the sexual partner of your choice. Because the behavior you have at that very moment can only be understood on the basis of this existential structure that is the core of everything you do. So this is why finally Merleau-Ponty sticks to this view that he calls the view of ambiguity. This is for me on page 168, probably for you on 195. So there's no There's no real way for me to tell you where. My sentence is, it is true that with Freud we have generalized the notion of sexuality.
Just his notion of consciousness.
What?
His notion of generality. Yeah, conscious.
The unconscious is later. Okay? I go on and then I'll tell you why and how it can be related. So the sentence is, because I'll keep about half an hour for the questions. How can it is true that with Freud we have generalized the notion of sexuality. How can we then talk about the distinctive development of sexuality? How can we identify a content of consciousness as sexual? Indeed, we cannot. Sexuality conceals itself from itself beneath a mask of generality and continually tries to escape from the tension and drama which it sets up. Drama meaning that it engages the whole existence. That's what it means. Okay, so now you jump about 10 lines after what I've just read to a sentence that starts with the dreamer, just before the dreamer. Okay, its sexuality is neither transcended in human life nor shown up as its center by unconscious representations. It is at all times present there like an atmosphere. So now we can understand the fact that sexuality is present in all the dimensions of life, and that thus you can't reduce them all to the explicitly sexual situations, because even in sexual situations, there are other meanings implied. The dreamer doesn't first visualize the latent content of his dream, what the dream really means, sort of, with its sexual implications. The one that is, which is to be revealed, with the help of physical images by the second account, which is the way second account in psychoanalysis means when you relate the dream you have. He doesn't first openly perceive the theory of genital origin as being genital, only subsequently translating the text into figurative language. For the dreamer, indeed, who is far removed from the language of the waking state, this or that genital excitation or sexual drive is, without more ado, this image of the world being climbed or his face being scanned, which is seen as obvious. Sexuality becomes issued in images which derive from it only certain typical relationships, typical existential relationships, that give figuration to your peculiar personality. Only a certain general emotional physiognomy that's present throughout the different layers of life and of personality. The dreamer's spirit becomes the serpent which appears in the manifest content. So finally, what you can say is that Merleau-Ponty goes on with his account of ambiguity and the fact that ambiguity ultimately means that sexuality is present throughout all the dimensions and within personal life in all the situations that you can encounter, even though it might not seem to present the same way when you're having a sexual contact and when you're in a completely different attitude. You remember what the sentence I quoted about half an hour. Yeah, when he said that there are sexual symptoms at the root of all neurosis, but these symptoms, correctly interpreted, symbolize a whole attitude. For example, one of conquest or of flight. So I think you have to relate what I just said. The fact that there's a particular part of the body that's being present, be it as a symptom or as a normal constituent of erotic psychic life, in all the dimensions of existence, and that for this very reason, there's no, say, layer or dimension, like the purely sexual, that you would have to start from in order to understand the others. Well, we didn't mean that sexuality would have no meaning at all, but that if you really want to understand the sexual part, you would have to see how the rest of life can be related to it, not meaning that it has to be related to it. It's one dimension in which existence is being symbolized or acquires a meaning. So it's a window through which you can see this existential structure that I've been talking about. Yeah.
The first question, I don't need to answer. Maybe you could keep in mind as you go on. You have to answer later. Really, it takes think it's a worthwhile question to interrupt you with. It has to do with the notion of the body as a general function transposition has become very, very general. Quite far removed from a more mundane, non-technical notion of the body.
What do you mean by physical body
Well,
as being the more mundane?
My question is just this, you know, a lot of the sentences that you read involving the term body, the term mind could have been used. And in fact, one sentence you read, this way the body expresses significance. It then goes on and writes, this incarnate significance is the central phenomenon of which body and mind find significance are abstract.
Okay, so now we're facing the problem of the English translation because Merleau-Ponty never uses mind. He uses esprit, which is spirit. It makes a big difference because Merleau-Ponty's account of the relationship between esprit and body stems from the lecture of Hegel that was carried on in France in these years, especially from a precise article from a precise guy who was the translator of Phenomenology of Spirit. So Merleau-Ponty, esprit means subject, and only subject, not mind.
Well, my real question is what body means. And because it's clear how the sort of Dreyfusian story about maximal grip goes in the case of sensory motor perception, but it just begins to get much more metaphorical. What it means about biology and the sexual and the subject. And in other words, it's a label for the problem. What is the subject? Well, what is the body? It's no longer clear what the body is. So I'm just wondering if you could come back to that as usual.
Well, actually, I'm pretty much done with what I wanted to say. So I have time to come back to this now. But the thing is, first of all, Merleau-Ponty wants to describe and not to explain. So he wants to find a way to relate these symptoms, so these dimensions. So it's not a I can do it. Look how I do it.
But there's two different structures here. I've been very persuaded or educated by your description of the ambiguity in the relation between biological, perceptual, and personal, sexual. That there is a kind of an ambiguity. But the body as a function of transposition within the theory has a kind of explanatory purpose vis-a-vis all these other things. If the body as a function of transposition is meaning to explain how it can be that we can move from one situation to another. And I just don't know how
it's meant to be the name of that thanks to which you can move from one situation to another, but certainly not to explain in the way you might consider it, except if you wanted to make by to explain a more generally speaking epistemological commitment. The thing is, ultimately, what it refers to in all these situations is that, and why does Merleau-Ponty talk about the body all the time? If you read the preface carefully, you see that he says that the reduction as carried on by Husserl cannot be done completely. There's something that remains from reduction, and this is the body. That's always, as he says about 200 times in the book, in front of consciousness. And this is how you have to understand this very peculiar experience. This is how you have to understand what he means by body, because precisely it's the fact that Merleau-Ponty doesn't want to say that conscience is bullshit.
Yes, but
he said, but let me finish, because I'm almost done. It just means that, generally speaking, in all these dimensions, the body is that thanks to which there's something happening to you prior to you having consciousness of it and orchestrating it or constituting it. This is the only thing that body means. Is that in all these layers and in all the various situations of personal life, be they sexual, whatever, there are things that happen that lead you to behave in such or such a way or another that give you, say, even personal affordances, whatever, that you experience as orienting you towards this or that. And so you sort of receive. It's a matter of conceiving how the relationship between the body and the consciousness is in terms of receptivity. This is a term that's very useful to understand what Merleau-Ponty means. So you're receptive because the body allows you to be receptive to all these different layers, and thus, thanks to the body, then you're being drawn towards this or that, and you act. And that's why the body is useful. It's to understand how you're being led the world orients you, even in the sensory motor perceptual level, as you remember Merleau-Ponty says it in the chapter on the thing. And the same experience you live at a completely different level, say, in the sexual intercourse. It's that you're not thinking, because consciousness means reflection, right? So you're thinking about what you're doing. And there's a basic layer, pre-reflective layer of experience, which is in which the consciousness is only receptive to what is carried towards it from the body frame.
So when you say that the body is the only thing that enables you to relate all the different conduct and activities of life, or it is that thing to which you can have a global picture, it sounds as if body is something you've been using to explain why you're drawn this way or that, or how you have the global picture. But it's become so vague now. Nature is what explains how you can have a global picture, or the world is that which explains how you can have
Well, no, nature does not explain why you have it. Because there can only be a subject insofar as you're embodied, because the body is that thanks to which there can be a subject. Without body, there would be no subject, right? It's only because of the body that you can understand, that you can see finally that there's a subject, because there's a common structure that's being widespread throughout all the different behaviors of the person.
So the body begins in the common structure, but I don't see it.
It's the name.
So there's not the availability of the common structure is not thanks to the body. The
No,
body
it's thanks to the body that you can understand through the guide first cerebral cortex. That there's a subject.
how does that work? How does the body do that?
Well, because it helps you understand the relationship between all the different things that you do, basically. It's not thanks to the consciousness that you can do this. It's only thanks to the body, because the consciousness can't find its way, or because the experiences that you have when you're what I'm supposed to say is that the experience that you have when you're hungry and well, the experience that you have when you're perceiving a chair can't be related only thanks to the consciousness, because it would be purely formal, meaning it wouldn't be you couldn't relate it to an experience. Whereas to him, there's a way to relate all these dimensions to an experience, which is the fact that the body is in front or standing forward with its prior interface with the world.
In another philosophical tradition, you can talk about consciousness not being reflection. And you might talk about consciousness being experience. The idea that whatever you're undergoing has some qualitative character for you.
Yeah.
So in that sense of experience, in that sense of consciousness, it sounds like the body is conscious from Merleau-Ponty. And so there's no appeal to reflectivity of intellect or understanding to make sense of the structure, but there is some primitive conception of human experience, which is so I'm trying,
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I think you can say that. So that, well, you would have to relate it to the fact that, as I mentioned previously at the beginning of the first lecture, there's this operative intentionality. That is what you can characterize the subject by. The subject is what relates the different moments of time, and what actually, in a way, creates them as being intentional moments, moments towards my grasping of bird striker in a thing, for example. So the thing is, then you would have to give another story in order to explain how and why you're being task related, and how and why you can understand or see someone being task related, thanks to the fact that you see his or her body moving and or doing such or such a thing.
gives it sound like just a statement. Biology, perception, sexuality, they're all related. That's what Merleau-Ponty is saying.
Well,
So it's all facets of our life.
except that it seems to be pretty much related with empirical work, as far as, for example, psychopathology is concerned, right?
Yeah.
Can I get into this? Yeah. It's hard to know once you said that all the layers are related, if you've added anything when you say thanks to the body. But let me just switch to the sexuality question first. Is that a sexually privileged dimension, or could we say, also an important existential dimension? And if you tell me I'm not related to everything, as food. I tell you what, I'm relation to something, and I don't know whether I've sublimated them, and I don't know. Why should we think that it's a general capacity to relate to everything? We think why should that this is some special dimension of human experience? I don't what you said to me last time has corrupted or cleared my mind, depending on what you think. But I mean, he knows there's an explanation of why he thinks the sexuality is a more important dimension.
But I think it's the opposite when you consider the Dreyfus direct when you say that you can have it. He wants to say that you can't separate
them all out. Well, then sexuality is no specialer than any of the others, because
no.
they're all
But
equally.
did I say Merleau-Ponty says that it's more special than the others?
Well, yes.
Well, I think to account for the personal level of behavior, sexuality is much more important than the need for food that you have. Maybe not the way you eat, or this can be a different story. But the fact that you need to eat is certainly not very personal. I think many other people in the room feel the same.
Right. Well, then let's take on the personal level your role in the culture. You're given an identity from the moment you're fitted into the family. That you got to take a stand on your own being by way of some role.
Well, he doesn't say the opposite either.
He doesn't what?
He doesn't say the opposite either.
No. I guess I'm asking again, why this chapter on sexuality rather than a chapter on, say, identity or on mood or food?
Because
there's an explanation.
Well, I think that's because you feel that something peculiar, something bodily peculiar happening when you're, first of all, when you're having sexual conduct. And he starts from this and then he says, okay, how can I relate this to the rest of existence? With regard to this specificity and to the specificity of the rest of existence, knowing that you can't consider the existence as having contingent or necessary parts.
They're all interrelated.
Yes, this is what he says.
Right.
At the end of the very end of the book.
Mention and speech, which also gets checked. And I'm just
because speech isn't personal. It's what allows you to have personal relations with other people. So it's the condition of personal
speech.
And sexuality occurs within this framework.
The speech is even more basic.
But it's not a matter of being basic
or more general.
Because
what the right words are here.
It's not more general. It's a part of the general.
But everything is a
consideration. That's what he wants to say.
But then he always disappears into this ambiguity story in which everything is related to everything. Well, why single out, say, speech and sexuality over food, over
because food doesn't seem to be very personal once again, and not very human, because animals eat as well, I think. So
yes, sex, yeah, that's right.
But it doesn't have the same dimension.
No,
you can talk of sexual instincts for animals, whereas for humans it's much more complicated. We have no comprehensions at the beginning of the chapter.
But he gets to the point where hair and fingernails and everything is equally essential to being human. Get whether it's in this chapter, but when everything is equal.
He talks about Pascal and the fact that he talks about Pascal, the French existentialist.
Actually, what to say? Well, if you say that, then I don't understand again why.
Because you're just skipping what's Merleau-Ponty's goal. The chapter.
I don't understand this goal.
Well, I've been talking about it for an hour now, so you're
Just one of us has a problem.
Why have you forgotten the questions that you've been asking me?
No,
because I kept answering them or trying to at least.
I haven't understood the answer. I give up. I let Martin say it.
Hold on, there's people on the line.
Well, whoever's next now, I don't know who's next because I played time.
But you were. Well,
originally
then.
So yeah, we did one.
Okay, right.
I don't know if it helps, but let's probably when you compare the capital motility for the similitude together, and the sexuality. It turns out that Schneider has a problem which is very much related in both chapters. You can't make this one for, I think, a chapter yesterday, maybe.
The second one.
Because you can't point but it means you can't be attracted to something outside of complete situation. You must quite understand how something can be And you can be affected by something or by someone or by some experience. So I would say this is the same special structure in
Operative
which
executive.
kind of sounds doesn't have, but it doesn't have. And so he explains it. But I don't know if it makes sense. Yeah. What did you say about that? Does it help people?
Yeah, it helps to understand the beginning of the chapter, but maybe what the actual, what I haven't been mentioning enough is that all the end of the chapter is a discussion. So most of what I've been discussing today is the only aim of this is to show that you can't reduce everything to sexuality.
No, that's true. That's not my example shows that too.
Yeah.
It's expressing skills dimensions that the same problem.
It starts from the fact that there's a peculiar bodily way of experiencing a specific kind of operative intentionality in sexual behavior. Two, there's an original dimension that's called sexuality in life. Three, most people say it's beyond the dimension in life. And most rejecting interpretations of Freud say that, is it true? And then discuss it.
What is the Freudian generality claim, whatever that is?
What? No.
Doesn't he?
No.
I thought he said it was a general atmosphere, a general structure.
He said that to him, you can interpret Freud as saying that.
And he doesn't agree with interpreting Freud as saying that, or he does. Yeah. Yeah. Already.
Freud is more complicated, and it related to the question about the unconscious has been raised previously, because the fact is, well, it can turn into very technical discussions, but the thing is, for Freud, once again, in the three states of sexual theory, he says that he says that there's a force that's called libido, sexual drive, that is the dynamical pattern to which you have to relate everything that happens in life. And Merleau-Ponty says, well, yes and no, it's very useful, but still you can't relate everything to it as if it would really be the basic. It gives you an insight on many things that no other dimension can give you an insight on.
That's for
Not meaning that it's the thing that you have to reduce everything to.
okay, but that I'm back to my generality atmosphere thing. That they claim that it's a special dimension that for Maoris and people in Bali, everything that people do is colored by their relation to their sexuality. Doesn't seem to be plausible at all. He just takes it over dogmatically from Freud and then gives it his first spin. But I don't understand where the basic claims that hold the generality of the sexual atmosphere. I doubt if it's the whole claim that it's sublimation or something that I think it is obvious that
Yeah, but that's Pascal's case, there's the point where you have to believe, right?
yeah, well, that's the point why I didn't sign the chapter. I don't believe it.
I don't mind.
Okay, well, the way I'm saying, you guys, I'm not exactly sure what I'm about to say. I'm sorry, I haven't mastered this book, but there are a few key passages that I think might be illuminating. So,
So you want to explain us, right?
That's
Okay,
right.
and read the key passages now?
I'm not going to read the passages. I'm going to give you like maybe a few lines in a second. So I think it's been trying to like take your body and your certainty of a subjective experience and collapse all the dimensions of existence into what you know to be certain to yourself. Which, okay, but I think he says in the other self, I think you have to expand your perspective and see it as a world, which doesn't take each body as a singular like subjectivity. I mean, they are subjective, and this is what the end of the book is about. He says because he has inherited his shared the fact remains that it is nevertheless from the subjectivity of each of us that that each one projects this one and only world. He talks about health freedom where my freedom, it is a state for me to be free. I am given to myself, and all this about how there can be a subjective experience that we're also sure of. But
Okay, so I think you brought enough topics to discuss for a year.
and
So
also
what's the point
I
of
like
this?
this. Oh, fine. Okay. So in the other Souls in the Human World chapter, at the end, he says, henceforth, he's talking about how you recognize another self, and he's talking about like recognizing familiar when you go in the world and familiar intentions. And he says, henceforth, as the parts of my body together comprise a system, so my body and the others are one whole, two sides of one and the same phenomenon, and the anonymous existence of which my body is the ever renewed phrase, henceforth inhabits both bodies simultaneously. So you have to get rid of the body and go and talk about the anonymous existence a little bit. I don't know.
First of all,
With all those dimensions and from a more something like something.
well, the thing is, the body is that thing to which there's an anonymous.
The body is very existent, but
Pardon me?
I mean, yeah. Okay. I don't know how to relate subjectivity to being in the world. I haven't even read.
Well, subjectivity is not something that Merleau-Ponty asserts. There has to be. Well, first of all, when you say you're certain of, no, you're not certain of anything big.
Well,
That's what
you don't say you're not certain of anything. You are certain of the world in general as a whole, but not of any one thing in particular.
Yeah, it's a presumptive certainty
Yeah, but
that you have to differentiate from the classical view on certainty. First, then we think about the anonymous level of experience, and that comes thanks to the body, because there can be no experience without it.
does that fit?
But it's that I was when we were discussing with Ava what this junior body meant, and I said that the body is the name of the experience that you have, that things come to your consciousness, and that you're motivated to act in such or such a way. So this is what anonymous means. It means that it hasn't yet reached the consciousness, but it's already providing a meaning that you choose to accomplish or not. And precisely, then you've been talking about freedom, and freedom, what is freedom? It's the fact that you can choose amongst different meanings that are available to you, thanks to the fact that the situation has different meanings. Always, it's always ambiguous within the personal dimension. That's why he discusses Marx at the end of the sexuality chapter. This is, and that's why you need the sexuality chapter to understand what he says in the freedom chapter, because fundamentally, freedom is ambiguity. It's the fact that a situation has different meanings and that you can choose among them. This might be a way for you to relate all the topics that you mentioned. So there can be no freedom without the body, which is against stuff. Says that you just choose at every moment what you're doing. In other words, he says, well, you can choose what you're going to be doing thanks to the fact that you're being led to different, say, directions of action. And this is thanks to the fundamental. First offense. One is that you take sexuality to, and the other one is that if you control next to, and that you can differentiate. I think both are not a big problem. And first of all, because I think that the sexual sexuality is not. He doesn't say this anymore, but he even goes as far as to say that you shouldn't have displayed.
It's an alien, and that's the problem, all right? What is it?
Yeah.
What?
What does it even mean?
Yes.
Well, it's just one of the biological perceptual personal.
Let's let Eric finish. I want you to finish.
There's also what I like to get this more clear is little footnotes at the end of the book, which I didn't like because it was by Marx.
No, I didn't like it because yeah, well, dogmatically it's the same.
Yeah, but what's happening there is speaking about history, speaking about various ways to see history from a point of economic basement, from a point of law, from a point of religion, and all these various descriptions. Reality is just one of them, but he says anyway, it's not one's truth, but another quoting. But in each particular case, one of the ordinary forgives them can be regarded as dominance. So in each particular situation, you can look what's going on there and still conclude that in this particular situation, perhaps what's most important. And in another situation, it can be the religion. Perhaps, but you can never assert it. Yeah, that's right.
But that's not the total linearity, doesn't it? That indeed, when I'm eating a steak, it's the biological food. Have sex is the sex situation, but
this isn't for me what you think. Otherwise, maybe we wouldn't have had to spend 3 hours on this. It's not that you're just being in this or that situation. Eric is right, because on the one hand you say, well, there's so much sexuality in it. And when you try to explain how it's related, but still differentiate it from the other dimensions, you say, well, it's mixed soup.
Well, because I don't understand how it's differentiated from the other dimensions. It seems to be. Tell me that that's not done. That's not just that situation that was dominant in the economic situation. I think that Marx thought there was something special about the economic. And Marx was nothing left to say.
Well, of course he has, because if you're in the chapter on the fetichism of the merchandise, the capital, one, then the state that ideal
Okay,
that, but then he resists.
then why is
The
there
whole chapter is about protection.
But then either you got to claim, let's go back to sexuality, the sex is the least important because every atmosphere is sexuality. Then you got a real claim. You could claim that in some situations it's more important than others. No situation comes to us any without sexuality anywhere.
This is what
What? Yes, that's what he's holding. That's right. So that's not what Eric would hold.
Now, but that's, would we hold that every every situation also has some economic,
Of course. Yes. And now it's become, and presumably gastronomic and so forth. And it's really,
well, maybe not, because that's going to be too isolated to other purposes, right? Is it originary in itself? I mean, it's a blend of the biological needs and the culture, right? So it might not be originary as it could.
that would be a So you're going to give me criteria or something like criteria for understanding what constitutes an original dimension. And I've been asking, because then we could see whether sex was and economics was, and if religion wasn't, for instance, then I would understand something. To say that in any situation, something is found, isn't
Well, so the thing is, what you're trying to say is that, well, maybe I can repeat this way, is that the marks of the picture of men, that we're discussing right. That's right. This is what you were saying when we at the end of last lecture, that he was French style floral.
I was coming back to that. Yes, I think this is just background that already we're sort of sharing, but I'll mention it. I mean, then she should get a chance to talk. But I mean, just that back in 1945, when this was written, no intellectual friends doubted that Freud and Marx had understood something super deep, universal, important, and they couldn't write anything without taking a stand.
Like Marcuse was teaching at Berkeley, right?
Like Marcuse was teaching, no, at Santa Cruz, but I'm sure there was somebody at Berkeley. No, at San Diego. But there was somebody here, I'm sure, teaching it too. It isn't French, but it was, but these people were, that's what they had to take. And then Foucault came along and just called it into question and said something like what I just said. Why should we believe that the atmosphere involved was sexual through and through? Or he put it that way, but I mean, why should we believe this part of Marx? But this whole chapter is based on the assumption Freud and Marx have got something right. Let's figure out the wrong way.
Well, I think you're being very influenced by Foucault in this one, but I won't go further into it.
What?
You're being very much influenced by your frequentation of Foucault in this one, but I don't.
Yeah, but I shouldn't be talking about that. Just let her talk. She has people,
Yeah.
whoever has their hand. I mean,
Wondering.
well, that's the problem. I mean, cool, we do. But that's not, but we are Freudianized and sexualized through and through. But that,
Well, okay, it's a claim. Let's hold this. I don't mind. Yeah, well, I think he makes towards this, the fact, well, obviously the fact that sexuality is an atmosphere, perhaps understanding how you could integrate it into the background. But intermingled, yeah, that's right. Yes. That's why all dimensions are always represented, even though there might be one of them that could be more prominent depending on the situation. Not meaning that you would have to completely exclude the others, because precisely it would be intermingled in the background. I'm also trying to figure out exactly what to make of all this, and I think one thing that might help with the discussion that we've been having is to zoom out a bit and remember what the whole book is about. And what is the whole book about? Well, and what does perception mean? Well, rather than answering your question, let me sort of put the way I was understanding it and see if it makes sense. The one thing that I've been slowly getting convinced of as we've read the book, and that what you have said
today in particular, really, I'm really convinced by is the idea that these accounts of perceptual consciousness, whether they're the sort of reflective intellectualist understanding of consciousness or even the one that Alba mentioned earlier, don't make sense of the phenomenon of perception because they don't make sense of embodiment. Now, when you start to take embodiment into account in different ways that we've discussed in the class, you have to start to consider all of the baggage that embodiment brings with it. And one of the dimensions that it brings is the sexual. So there is a way in which that an atmosphere for our whole existence, that's important in a way. I just named it bird in a book about perception, because if perception is going to be based not on one of these forms of consciousness, but rather on the kind of embodiment which then embodiment is going to also
Brain cycle, yeah, exactly.
And we have to breathe, and we have to eat. I mean, why the sexual privilege? They all
Can I speak just to that? There's wonderful passages on page 157 in the old edition that he read, where he talks about intentionality as a as a sort of as having its own, it can part of the intentional art. And sexuality is not an autonomous fight, where it has internal links to the whole active problem of being.
Yeah,
the claim that is made is that within the domain of the personal, there's three significant ways of relating to the world. Not that one is more basic than the other. There's knowing about the world, there's acting on the world, and there's wanting to have sex with the world. That's possible. That's plausible. Yeah, it's plausible. Plausible. Yeah. But because the point is, sexuality is a mode of perceiving. When you perceive things in a sexual way, then everything is colored by sex. And when you're there's no sense of reduction to it. And by the way, this is the key answer to your question, picking up on what Jake said, that now becomes substantially big, is that sexuality is a mode of, it's a kind of perceiving. It's a kind of perceiving. And it's not the case that when you're engaged in impersonal or a pre-personal perceiving, that you're implicitly, subliminally, or repressively involved in sexual perceiving. No. But there is a way of relating to the world which is sexual, which is a mode of perceptual relation to the world, and which is a component structure within the personal.
Do you see the atmosphere of all relational? All in the atmosphere for that.
which means that you can't take away this dimension, or you couldn't assert that it's absolutely contingent or unnecessary more than any other dimension. That's the question.
Let's remember, I feel
I'm going to say exactly what you say, but I have a neighbor who experiences the world through three. I mean, she sees everything as a walking. I mean, that's not her mode of structure, conscious structure. I think that's just.
We got it backwards. We got it backwards. We're both there. But we got it backwards. The problem is to understand. The problem is to understand how one could. Really, the problem is to understand how sexuality could be. What is the exact expression? We discover both that sexuality is one more form of original intentionality. That's the question is asking how sexuality can be a form of intentional. Original intentionality.
original, not just any of it. Original is you get.
No.
Of course not. No.
Of course not.
It means a source.
It means a source. It doesn't mean general. How can be a source of intentionality? That is how it can be a mode directed into the world.
But you've got the quote at it is at all times present like an atmosphere. And that's the challenge.
It doesn't mean that that's what determines what you're doing, and hence freedom comes into play.
It's present as an atmosphere, but you can ignore it. That's the claim.
Yes.
I would say.
It must be the most.
But why should I believe it's present as an atmosphere and I'm ignoring it? Why not just believe it's no more present as an atmosphere?
That's not the main claim of the chapter. No, it's a very supportive, it's almost a throwaway claim. If you delete that sentence in the chapter and not lose all the positive stuff you're saying about sexuality's original source.
If I delete it, which is fine with me, what takes its place in making the sexual dimension more originary than the other dimension? That's the question.
But you can't explain Can't
Yeah,
explain.
there's a part of the experience that you can't explain. That's it.
No, this is a bit more precise than that. You can't explain sexuality to the world in terms of any other dimension.
And the same perception. And
I mean, the same perception. So interpersonal.
But what's the problem? Is it just the fact that he put forward sexuality as being an ordinary dimension? Because I mean, it's obvious that in some behaviors, it's what comes into play first and foremost. That's about everything he said.
some behaviors don't come into play at all. At least.
Okay? Of course, but that's why I was. But well, I thought I was clear about the fact that he wouldn't go as far as to say that libido is the thing that you would have to reduce everything to. Okay, so he says this.
That's right.
So he doesn't agree with Freud.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
Which is pretty important to understand the
Right.
chapter. And then the reason I said his brain and freedom comes to play is that you could say, or you could agree with the fact that the other dimensions are co-present in, say, an experience that's not primarily sexually related. Well, then fine, you're doing something else.
At all times, unless we throw away the line, which I don't think is so accidental, but at all times the atmosphere will be perfect. And that's a claim about the background. That somehow sexuality is always in the background.
Yeah, why not? But think of the fact that you might be led for a reason that you don't even imagine in this or that situation. Say you're walking down the street and you're going to the grocery store, right? To buy whatever.
And you might not be. Like when you're in
And then you're trying. Then you begin. There's the sexual background that comes into your mind. So you begin fantasizing whatever, and then it leaves your mind. That's what I mean.
Say that strategically to conclude that it was always already there. That it came into my mind shows that in every case it could have come into my mind, but it's always there in the background. Period. I mean, maybe that's true. Boy, I mean, argument for that seems to me. But I getting building the different.
Affected by.
Yeah. It's the beginning of the chapter.
Yeah. What I've talked about last time.
That's what's important. Yeah, okay. What page?
Let me just read the paragraph.
Yeah, get back to that.
It wants to like the first meeting for us. Because we're using
Paragraph of the chapter. Yeah, the end of the first paragraph.
He then wants to bring to light a further meaning for us. We must finally look at that area of reality only. Why? So I was trying to see how pickup genes begins to exist for us to activities to see that we mosaic is affective states of pleasures. Okay, so we know that the second sentence that you read is an account that he completely rejects.
Here's what?
It's an account that he completely rejects.
The second paragraph is supposed to be yeah.
The beginning is about the aversion. Totally different with my question to you. What does he mean by the effect of life? It's the life of desire. I think it's. I mean, so it's what's related to sexuality. It might be more clearly put to say that third dimension is the effect of sexuality. Like there's
Then he goes on and says
it's like love.
he doesn't say it.
Appetite. It's not have to be related to a sexual act. Like and your desires. When I don't think anything would be led to what this is. I think people are thinking of something too specific. It's actually a more general concept that is applicable to body in general, not all three dimensions of. Yeah. Well, I didn't think. So you discuss all about. I'm trying to argue for your side here. Yeah, sure. I didn't understand that first, but maybe you.
But then it goes right into Schneider's kind of sexuality, and then it goes to Freud, and then it goes into Winston. You don't get anything about any other activity.
But the point is not that Schneider can't have sex, it's that you can't feel desire.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
The point is not that Schneider can't have sex. The point is that he can't feel desire.
Yeah, well, that's all right.
The reason why you get that.
Can't perceive attractiveness.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's perceptual.
Yeah.
No attractiveness.
Can't perceive attractiveness.
So the examples in this chapter of women.
But you can't perceive them as attractive. So you can't perceive them as attractive.
That's sexual.
It's a mode perception. It's a kind of perception that isn't explicable in terms of pre-personal perception.
Yeah, I don't know if we're disagreeing about that. It's a kind of perception, namely sexual perception.
Yeah.
Okay. But then go back to, I think if he did what you wanted to do, I think it'd be a much more interesting chapter. It'd be talking about, but I think Paul's the famous point instead of what we've never said. And that's the first, I think the first paragraph.
What's the difference between the rest of the first
We're
section?
two drafts at a time.
Okay, we're at this one.
Thanks for the.
And the, whole thing, and so, but like, you went, like, taking a little ground, maybe the, boarding car. And, we got the thing where, you know, totally honestly, total access, bounded by people taking the body, but then, not everything is totally unconscious, we don't have total, so we don't have anything, in access to it, so. Taking the single ground, so like, what is the notion of responsibility? Because here he has this thing, and he talks, it's clear, right? And he talks about the guy who got the book. Yeah, so like, what's the culture of responsibility? Yeah, okay.